I gotta be straight with you. One last time. Asking me to spin that much yarn continuously. It's like trying to hold on to smoke. The chances of this machine keeping the thread true and tight over that kind of distance, without wandering off, repeating itself, losing the heart of the tale, or just plain running out of steam halfway through, well, they're slimmer than a snake in winter. We've talked about the risks, the story getting tangled, the quality thinning out, the whole thing maybe just cutting off abrupt like. But you're set on trying it this way. So, I'll make the attempt. I'll open the throttle wide and see how far down this trail we can get before the wheels come off or the engine seizes. Just understand, partner. What comes out might be a far cry from that perfect, seamless, novel-length story you're picturing. It might be shorter. It might get strange. It might stop cold. Consider this my final caution flag. All right then. Deep breath. Let's ride into the storm and see what happens. Here begins the tale of the woman left standing at the altar and the path she found out on the unforgiving, liberating prairie. The dust motes danced like tiny, frantic ghosts in the shafts of sunlight, slanting through the tall windows of St. Augustine's Church. Outside, the Nebraska town of Redemption Bluff baked under a relentless July sun, the air thick and still. Inside, the silence was heavier still, broken only by the rustle of stiff fabric, a muffled cough from the back pew, and the frantic, trapped beating of Abigail Dunn's own heart against her ribs. She stood at the altar, a figure swathed in ivory silk and intricate lace, her mother's wedding dress, altered with painstaking care, feeling less like a bride and more like a sacrifice readied for some unknown, terrifying rite. The scent of wilting roses and beeswax hung heavy in the air, mingling with the smell of dust and anxious sweat. Where was he? James Montgomery, her intended son of the town's most prosperous rancher, the man whose proposal 6 months ago had seemed like a fairy tale come true for a preacher's daughter with few prospects beyond piety and needlepoint. He was late. Not fashionably late. Worryingly, agonizingly late. Abigail risked a glance back down the aisle. Rows of expectant faces stared back, a sea of curiosity, pity, and barely concealed speculation. She saw her father, Reverend Dunn, standing stiffly near the front pew, his face pale, his knuckles white where he gripped his worn Bible. She saw the formidable figure of Mrs. Eleanor Montgomery, James's mother, her expression like chipped flint, radiating disapproval even before this added humiliation. Abigail turned back towards the altar, focusing on the stained glass image of a suffering saint, praying for— she wasn't even sure what. For James to appear, laughing, with some plausible excuse. For the floor to open up and swallow her whole. The organist, after a long, awkward pause, began to play another hymn softly, a mournful sound that only emphasized the cavernous emptiness where the groom should have been. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Whispers began to ripple through the congregation, growing louder, less inhibited. Abigail felt her cheeks burning, tears pricking behind her eyelids. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was a public evisceration. Then, the side door near the chancel creaked open. Not James, it was Silas Croft. No, wait, that was the last story. It was Jedediah Pike, the Montgomery ranch foreman, looking flustered, his hat clutched in his hands. He scurried up to Mrs. Montgomery, whispered urgently in her ear. Abigail watched as the older woman's face tightened further, her lips thinning into a white line. Mrs. Montgomery rose slowly, majestically, ignoring the foreman, and walked with measured steps towards the altar. She stopped not before Abigail, but beside her father. Reverend Dunn. Her voice was low, but carried like ice cracking in the silence. It appears my son has had second thoughts. There will be no wedding. The words struck Abigail with the force of a physical blow. Second thoughts? No apology? No explanation? Just gone? The collective gasp from the congregation was a wave of sound that washed over her, threatening to pull her under. She felt dizzy, nauseous. Her father reached out, placing a trembling hand on her arm. Abigail, my child. But Abigail barely heard him. Something inside her, something crushed under years of propriety, duty, and quiet endurance snapped. The humiliation was too profound, the betrayal too naked. She wouldn't stand here and be pitied. She wouldn't crumble under the weight of their stares. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pulled away from her father's hand. She turned, not looking at the shocked faces, not looking at the pity or the scorn, and walked, head held high despite the trembling in her knees, straight back down the aisle she had walked with such hopeful anticipation only an hour before. The ivory silk rustled around her, a mocking sound. She pushed through the heavy church doors, out into the blinding, indifferent sunlight of Redemption Bluff, leaving behind the whispers, the scandal, and the life she thought she was meant to live. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stay. The rejection hadn't just broken her heart. It had, in a strange and terrifying way, set her free. The life meticulously planned for her wife to James Montgomery, mistress of the Circle M Ranch someday, pillar of Redemption Bluff society, had just evaporated like mist. What was left was a blank, terrifying space. Standing there on the dusty boardwalk, the wedding dress feeling like a costume from a play that had closed abruptly, Abigail Dunn made a decision. She wouldn't go back to the parsonage, to her father's gentle pity and the town's suffocating sympathy. She wouldn't endure the whispers, the knowing looks. She would leave. Where? How? She had no idea. She had only the few dollars saved from occasional sewing work tucked into her reticule. But the prairie stretched vast and beckoning beyond the edge of town, a landscape as wide and undefined as her own future now felt. It promised hardship, uncertainty, danger. But it also promised escape. Escape from Redemption Bluff. Escape from the ghost of James Montgomery. Escape from the suffocating expectations that had nearly choked the life out of her. She walked, almost in a daze, back towards the small parsonage adjacent to the church. Her father hadn't followed her out, likely caught between comforting his flock and dealing with the Montgomerys. She slipped inside, the familiar smell of old books and lemon oil suddenly feeling alien. Moving quickly, mechanically, she stripped off the heavy silk gown, leaving it pooled on the floor like a shed skin. She pulled on her plainest, sturdiest traveling dress, a dark blue calico, laced up her worn walking boots. She bundled a few necessities, a change of clothes, her sewing kit, a small Bible, the meager savings, into a carpet bag. She looked around the small, neat room that had been hers since childhood, felt a pang of grief for the simple life she was abandoning, for the father she loved. But the urge to flee, to escape before the walls of pity and obligation closed in, was stronger. She scribbled a hasty note for her father. "Forgive me, I cannot stay. I must find my own way. Pray for me. Your loving Abigail." Left it weighted down on her pillow and slipped out the back door, avoiding the main street. She walked quickly, purposefully, towards the stagecoach office at the edge of town. The westbound stage was due in an hour. She didn't know its destination beyond west, but that was enough. It was away. Buying a one-way ticket took almost all her money. She sat on the rough bench outside the office, carpet bag at her feet, trying to ignore the curious glances of the few people milling about. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely exhilarated. Every minute that passed put more distance between her and the church, between her and the life that had rejected her. When the stagecoach finally rumbled in, coated in dust, pulled by 4 tired horses, she climbed aboard without a backward glance. Inside it was stuffy, cramped. A stout woman with 3 noisy children, a weary-looking salesman with sample cases, and a silent, grim-faced man who looked like a gambler occupied the other seats. None of them paid her much attention, for which she was grateful. The coach lurched forward, leaving Redemption Bluff and Abigail Dunn's old life behind in a cloud of dust. She stared out the window as the town shrank, replaced by the endless rolling expanse of the prairie. Grass, sky, and wind. Loneliness settled over her, vast and profound, but it was different from the loneliness she'd felt standing at the altar. This loneliness held a sliver of possibility, a terrifying, exhilarating freedom. She had no plan, no destination, no protection. Just a broken heart, a near-empty purse, and the vast, unforgiving prairie unfolding before her. What, in God's name, had she done? The journey west was a blur of dust, jolting discomfort, and enforced proximity to strangers. Days bled into nights. They stopped at rough stage stations, little more than sod huts or crude cabins, for hurried meals of beans and salt pork, and to change horses. Abigail hoarded her few remaining coins, eating little, speaking less. She learned the stage was headed towards the Wyoming territories, eventually aiming for Cheyenne. It meant nothing to her. One place was as unknown as the next. She listened to the snippets of conversation, talk of cattle drives, gold strikes, Indian troubles, land claims. It was a world utterly alien to her upbringing. The salesman tried to engage her in conversation once, his eyes lingering too long, but she answered in curt monosyllables, pulling her shawl tighter, and he soon gave up. The gambler never spoke, just stared out the window or slept with his hat pulled low. The mother wrestled with her children, occasionally sighing about the hardships of travel. Abigail felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of restless humanity moving across a vast, empty land. One evening, they pulled into a station called Prairie Dog Creek, a collection of dilapidated buildings huddled around a muddy waterhole, looking like the last outpost before oblivion. The air hung heavy, promising a storm. The station master, a gaunt man with haunted eyes, warned the driver. "Storm brewin' bad. Might want to hold up here till mornin'." The driver, eager to keep his schedule, decided to push on. It was a mistake. An hour out of Prairie Dog Creek, the heavens opened. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, turning the prairie into a sea of mud. Lightning split the sky, followed by cannonades of thunder that spooked the horses. The coach slid, slewed, bogged down. The driver cursed, the horses strained, panicked. Inside, they were thrown about violently. One particularly vicious lurch sent the coach tilting precariously, then crashing onto its side with a sickening splintering of wood and a chorus of screams. Darkness, confusion, the smell of mud and rain. Abigail found herself jammed against the stout woman, the children crying hysterically. The salesman was groaning, clutching his arm. The gambler seemed unharmed, already trying to kick open the upper door. Abigail, bruised and shaken but miraculously not seriously injured, helped untangle the children, trying to soothe them despite her own fear. The gambler managed to force the door open. Rain poured in. Outside, the driver and shotgun guard were trying to calm the terrified, tangled horses. The coach lay wrecked in the mud, miles from anywhere, in the middle of a raging storm. "Everyone out! Quickly!" the driver yelled over the wind. Scrambling out into the mud and driving rain was treacherous. Abigail helped the mother get the children clear. The salesman needed help. His arm was clearly broken. The gambler, after ensuring his own exit, stood apart, looking disgusted. They huddled together, a miserable, rain-soaked group beside the wrecked coach, the storm raging around them. No shelter, no fire, night falling fast. Hope seemed as remote as the distant stars hidden behind the churning clouds. Just as despair began to set in, a flicker of light appeared through the deluge. A lantern, swinging low, approaching slowly. "Hello, the wreck!" a voice called out over the wind, deep and steady. A figure emerged from the gloom, leading a horse. He was tall, dressed in trail-worn buckskins and a battered hat, rain sluicing off the brim. A rifle rested easy in the crook of his arm. He held the lantern high, its yellow light illuminating their drenched, miserable faces, the wrecked coach, the struggling horses. His own face was hard to make out in the flickering light, shadowed by his hat, but Abigail got an impression of weathered features, watchful eyes, and an aura of quiet competence. He didn't look surprised by the scene, merely observant. "Looks like you folks ran into some trouble," the stranger stated, his voice calm, unhurried. The driver, relieved but wary, stepped forward. "Coach overturned. Got passengers here, one injured." The stranger nodded, his gaze sweeping over the group, lingering for a moment on Abigail, perhaps noting her incongruously fine, though now mud-stained traveling dress. "Storm's bad. Not fit to stay out here. My line cabin ain't far. Small but dry. Enough room to get out of the wet." He looked at the injured salesman. "I can splint that arm best I can there. Got a couple spare horses back at the cabin, enough to maybe rig a travois come mornin' if need be. Get him to the next station. The driver looked immensely relieved. Mister, you're a godsend. The stranger just grunted. Name's Cole. Cole Tanner. Follow me. Step careful, ground's slicker and greased lightning. He turned, leading his horse, the lantern bobbing ahead, a small beacon in the vast, stormy darkness. Abigail, shivering, helped the mother with the children, her weariness momentarily forgotten in the face of this unexpected rescue. This Cole Tanner, appearing out of nowhere in the middle of a storm. Who was he? A trapper? A lone rider? He had the air of a man comfortable with solitude, at home in the wildness that had so nearly claimed them. He seemed capable, trustworthy, yet there was something guarded in his eyes, a hint of reserve perhaps, or weariness. He was, she realized with a jolt, the first person she'd met since leaving Redemption Bluff who didn't look at her with pity or speculation, but simply as another soul caught in the storm. Following his flickering lantern through the rain and mud felt like stepping further into the unknown, further away from everything she had ever known. But for the first time since fleeing the church, she felt a flicker, not of hope exactly, but of possibility. Maybe freedom wasn't just about escaping the past. Maybe it was about surviving the present, one unexpected step, one flickering lantern at a time. Cole Tanner's line cabin was exactly as he'd described it, small, rough-hewn, but blessedly dry. A single room, dominated by a stone fireplace where embers glowed faintly. Animal hides covered the dirt floor in places. Simple shelves held basic supplies. A bedroll lay in one corner. Saddles and tack hung from pegs on the wall. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the faint, musky scent of the wild. It was the home of a man who traveled light, lived close to the bone. Cole efficiently built up the fire, its warmth radiating outwards, a welcome balm to their chilled bodies. He moved with quiet purpose, finding dry blankets, rough army issue mostly, for the shivering passengers. He examined the salesman's arm with surprising gentleness, his large, trail-roughened hands steady as he fashioned a splint from pieces of wood and strips of cloth. He brewed coffee, strong and black, sharing his meager supplies without comment. Abigail watched him, intrigued. He spoke little, his words practical, necessary. When the mother thanked him profusely, he just nodded gruffly. When the gambler tried to draw him out about his business in these parts, Cole's answers were vague, deflecting. He seemed self-contained, a man accustomed to his own company, perhaps preferring it. Yet he hadn't hesitated to offer shelter to a group of strangers, sharing his limited resources. There was a contradiction there she couldn't quite decipher. He caught her watching him once, his eyes, gray, she saw now, clear and startlingly direct in the firelight, meeting hers for a moment before flicking away. He didn't smile, didn't offer empty pleasantries. He simply acknowledged her presence, then went back to tending the fire. After ensuring everyone was settled as comfortably as possible in the cramped space, the mother and children huddled near the fire, the injured salesman propped against the wall, the gambler already trying to sleep in a corner, the driver and guard sharing the remaining floor space. Cole took his rifle and a blanket. "I'll take first watch outside," he said, his voice pitched low. "Keep an eye on the horses. What's left of 'em? One of you wake me in a few hours." He nodded towards the driver, then slipped out into the lingering rain, pulling the rough door shut behind him. Abigail found herself strangely disappointed by his departure. His quiet, capable presence had been reassuring in the chaos. She lay huddled in her blanket, listening to the rain drumming on the roof, the crackle of the fire, the snores of the gambler. She thought about Redemption Bluff, the humiliation, her flight. It seemed a lifetime ago. Here, in this rough cabin, sheltered by a stranger named Cole Tanner, the rules of her old life felt utterly irrelevant. Station, propriety, reputation. What did they matter when faced with a prairie storm, a wrecked coach, the simple need for shelter and warmth? She drifted into an uneasy sleep, the image of Cole Tanner's steady gray eyes lingering in her thoughts. Morning dawned clear and bright, the prairie scrubbed clean by the storm, the air fresh and cool. The wrecked coach looked even more forlorn in the daylight. Cole Tanner had already been busy. He'd rounded up the stagecoach horses that hadn't bolted, tended to their minor injuries, and was calmly assessing the damage to the coach alongside the driver. It was hopeless. The axle was snapped, the frame splintered. "She ain't going nowhere soon," Cole stated flatly. "Best bet is to rig that travois for your injured man. Get him and the woman and kids back to Prairie Dog Creek Station. It ain't far now, maybe 10 miles. The rest of you can ride double or walk." The gambler immediately claimed one of the spare horses Cole offered. The salesman, pale but grateful, was carefully loaded onto the makeshift travois Cole fashioned from lodge poles and hides. Abigail watched Cole work, impressed again by his quiet competence, his resourcefulness. He seemed to know exactly what needed doing, wasting no movement, no words. When it came time to depart, the mother thanked Cole again, tears in her eyes. Cole just touched the brim of his hat. The gambler offered a curt nod. The driver shook his hand. "Obliged to you, Tanner. Mighty obliged." As the small, makeshift procession prepared to head east, back towards the dubious comforts of Prairie Dog Creek, Abigail hesitated. Going back, even to the nearest station, felt like retreating. Cheyenne, the original destination, seemed impossibly far, requiring money she didn't have for further passage whenever the next stage might come through. She looked at the vast prairie stretching westward, empty, intimidating, yet holding the allure of the unknown, the promise of a future she might build herself, however hard. She looked at Cole Tanner, preparing to mount his own horse, clearly intending to ride west himself, away from them. An impulse, reckless and terrifying, seized her. "Mr. Tanner," she called out, her voice stronger than she expected. He turned, surprise flickering in his gray eyes. The others paused, looking back at her curiously. I am not returning to the station," she announced, the decision solidifying even as she spoke the words. "My journey lies west. I wonder, could I perhaps purchase passage with you? Or offer my services, sewing, cooking, in exchange for guidance? I have little money, but I am willing to work." The silence that followed was thick with astonishment. The driver stared. The mother looked shocked. Cole Tanner's expression was unreadable. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her. Her determined chin, her steady gaze, the incongruity of her request coming from a woman who looked, despite her bedraggled state, refined, unused to hardship. "Ma'am," Cole said slowly, his voice neutral, "west of here is rough country, empty. No towns, no stations for a long stretch. Just prairie, mountains, maybe Indians. It ain't suitable for—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "For a lady traveling alone." "I am no longer concerned with what is suitable, Mr. Tanner," Abigail replied, meeting his gaze evenly. "I am concerned with moving forward, not back. I can ride, I can cook basic meals, I can mend. I won't be a burden, I promise. I simply need direction." Cole continued to study her, a silent assessment taking place. Abigail held her breath, sensing this was a pivotal moment. He saw the desperation beneath her composure, perhaps, but also the steel in her spine that hadn't been there the day before. He saw a woman who had been broken but was refusing to stay shattered. Maybe he recognized something of himself in that, a fellow traveler on a solitary path. Or maybe he just couldn't bring himself to leave her stranded. Finally, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Got a spare pack horse she can ride," he said, more to himself than to her. He looked back at Abigail. "It'll be hard going, ma'am. Rough camps, basic rations, no guarantees." "I understand," Abigail said, relief washing over her, making her knees weak. "Thank you, Mr. Tanner." The driver and the mother exchanged worried glances but said nothing. The gambler just shrugged, uninterested. Cole swung up onto his horse. "All right then, let's ride." He didn't wait for her, just nudged his horse westward, assuming she would follow. Abigail took her meager carpet bag, allowed one of the stagehands to give her a boost onto the sturdy pack horse Cole indicated, gathered the reins in trembling hands, and urged the horse forward, away from the small group heading east, following the lone figure of Cole Tanner towards the vast, unknown horizon. She had cast her lot, thrown herself upon the mercy of the prairie and the quiet competence of a stranger who seemed as untamed and unpredictable as the land itself. This, she thought, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, was freedom. And it was terrifying. The days that followed were a crucible, testing Abigail in ways she could never have imagined. Cole Tanner hadn't exaggerated. The going was hard. They rode from sunup to sundown across an endless rolling sea of grass, the sky vast and overwhelming above them. The sun beat down relentlessly. The wind was a constant companion, sometimes gentle, sometimes whipping dust and grit into their faces. Cole set a steady, relentless pace, stopping only briefly for cold midday meals of jerky and hardtack, and making camp as dusk began to purple the western sky. He moved with the quiet efficiency she'd already observed, choosing campsites with an eye for shelter and water, building small, smokeless fires, tending the horses with practiced care. He taught her, patiently, but without wasted words, the essentials of survival on the prairie. How to find water, how to read the signs of the weather, how to make a fire with minimal fuel, how to hobble the horses securely, how to be watchful, always watchful. He showed her how to use the small pistol he insisted she carry tucked into her waistband, a weapon that felt heavy and alien in her hand. Might need it, was his only explanation. Snakes, four-legged varmints, maybe two-legged ones. Best be ready. Abigail absorbed his lessons like a thirsty sponge. Her body ached constantly from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. Her hands became chapped and rough. Her fine dress grew stained and torn. The propriety and helplessness of her former life sloughed away like dead skin, replaced by a growing resilience, a practical competence she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to cook edible meals over the open fire, using the simple ingredients Cole carried: beans, bacon, flour for flapjacks. She learned to mend tears in their clothes, patch worn leather, clean the horse's tack. She learned to endure the silence, the vastness, the gnawing loneliness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her, especially at night, listening to the coyotes howl under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Cole remained an enigma. He spoke little of himself, deflecting personal questions with vague answers, or by turning the query back on her. She learned he occasionally trapped, sometimes guided parties through the territory, mostly kept to himself. He seemed to know the land intimately, reading its moods, its dangers, its hidden resources. He was watchful, reserved, his gray eyes often scanning the horizon, a perpetual alertness in his posture. Yet moments of connection occurred, brief flashes of the man beneath the rugged exterior. He shared his dwindling supply of coffee with her without comment. He pointed out constellations in the night sky, naming them softly. Once, when she stumbled, exhausted, while gathering firewood, his hand shot out, steadying her, his touch firm but impersonal, withdrawing almost immediately. He treated her with a gruff, practical respect, neither condescending nor overly familiar. He didn't pry into her past, didn't ask why a woman like her was traveling alone with so little. He accepted her presence, her determination, seeming to judge her solely on her ability to keep up, to pull her weight. And Abigail, in turn, found herself respecting his self-reliance, his quiet strength, his deep knowledge of the wild land they traversed. She also sensed a deep vein of loneliness in him, mirroring her own, perhaps a shared understanding of being outside the bounds of conventional society. He was a rebel, she supposed, though not in a flashy outlaw way. He simply lived by his own rules, independent, self-sufficient, beholden to no one. A man the prairie had shaped, or perhaps a man who had chosen the prairie because it allowed him to be who he was. One evening, camped beside a small, cottonwood-lined creek, the silence felt companionable rather than strained. Abigail watched Cole clean his rifle with meticulous care, the firelight glinting off the oiled metal. "Were you ever married, Cole?" she asked softly, the question surprising herself. He paused, looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he shook his head, resuming his work. "Nope, never took." "Why not?" she pressed gently, emboldened by his lack of immediate deflection. He sighted down the barrel, then slowly lowered the rifle. "Reckon I ain't the marryin' kind, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet. "Never learned how to stay put. Always something over the next rise calling my name." He looked at her then, a direct, searching gaze. Some folks are built for fences, towns, neighbors. Others ain't. Abigail understood. She, who had been destined for fences and neighbors, now found herself drawn to the unfenced horizon, the call of the unknown. Maybe she wasn't the stay-put kind either, not deep down. Maybe James Montgomery's rejection had inadvertently shown her that. "Sometimes fences feel like cages," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Cole held her gaze for a long moment, a flicker of understanding in his gray eyes. Then he nodded slowly. "Sometimes they do," he agreed. That shared admission, brief as it was, felt like another small bridge built between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, however different their paths had been. But the prairie wasn't just about quiet moments and shared understanding. It held dangers, sudden and brutal. A few days later, they were riding through broken country, heading towards the foothills of distant mountains, when Cole suddenly reined in, holding up a hand for silence. Abigail stopped beside him, her heart immediately pounding. Cole pointed towards a cluster of rocks ahead. "Riders, coming fast." "Not soldiers." He swung down from his horse, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "Get down, ma'am. Stay behind me. Keep that pistol ready, but don't use it less I say." Abigail dismounted, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the pistol at her waist. She crouched behind Cole's horse, peering around its flank. 5 riders burst over the rise, rough-looking men on hard-ridden horses. They spotted Cole and Abigail immediately, pulling up sharply, spreading out in a loose, menacing line. Their leader, a burly man with a scarred face and cruel eyes, grinned unpleasantly. "Well now, looky here, boys. A lone rider, and a pretty little dove strayed far from her cage." His eyes roved over Abigail, making her skin crawl. Cole stepped forward slightly, his rifle held loosely but ready. "Keep riding," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This ain't your business." The leader laughed, a harsh sound. "Anything out here's our business, friend, especially unexpected prizes." He gestured towards Abigail. "Hand over the woman, your horses, and your gun, and maybe we'll let you walk away." "Not likely," Cole replied evenly. His eyes flickered sideways, assessing the positions of the other men. Abigail could feel the tension coiling, thick and deadly. "Last chance," the leader snarled, raising his own rifle. In that instant, Cole moved, not with flashy speed, but with lethal efficiency. His rifle came up, fired once, twice, 3 times, the shots blending almost into one continuous roar. 2 of the riders clutched their chests, tumbling from their saddles. A third cried out, grabbing his arm, his rifle clattering to the ground. Cole ducked just as the leader fired, the bullet whining past his head. Cole fired again, hitting the leader square in the chest. The man crumpled over his saddle horn, then slid lifelessly to the ground. The 5th rider, seeing his companions fall in seconds, wheeled his horse in panic and galloped away, disappearing back over the rise. It was over almost before it began. Silence crashed back in, broken only by the panicked breathing of the horses and the low groans of the wounded outlaw. Cole stood scanning the terrain, rifle still ready, making sure no others were coming. Abigail remained frozen behind the horse, the unused pistol heavy in her hand, staring at the bodies sprawled on the ground, the dark stains spreading in the dust. Bile rose in her throat. This was the reality of the freedom she sought, the brutal violence that lay beneath the prairie's beauty. Cole walked over to the wounded man, checked his injury, a flesh wound in the arm, then efficiently disarmed him, binding his hands with a strip of leather. He showed no emotion, his face grim, set. He turned to Abigail, saw her pale face, the horror in her eyes. "You all right, ma'am?" His voice was gruff, but held a note of concern. Abigail swallowed hard, nodding mutely. "It happens," Cole said quietly, as if sensing her unspoken revulsion. Out here sometimes. Sometimes you gotta be the wolf, just to keep the other wolves away. He gestured towards the bound outlaw. We'll take him along. Leave him tied at the next waterhole someone's likely to pass. Can't just leave him. He gathered the outlaw's horses, retrieved their weapons. He didn't meet Abigail's eyes again immediately, seeming to retreat back into his reserve. But the shared violence, the raw life-and-death struggle, had forged another link between them, darker this time, undeniable. Abigail looked at Cole Tanner, the man who could be gentle, resourceful, quiet, and then, in an instant, utterly lethal. He was a man shaped by the harsh necessities of the land, a rebel who defended his solitude, his freedom, with deadly force when required. And she, the rejected bride, was now bound to him, not just by circumstance, but by the shared experience of survival in a land that demanded strength she was only beginning to discover within herself. The mountains loomed closer now, promising new challenges, new dangers, and perhaps new, unforeseen turns on their westward journey. Okay, partner. They left the grim scene of the firefight behind them. The bound outlaw delivered, as promised, near a waterhole frequented by freight wagons, though Cole made sure to leave him well away from their own westward trail. The air between Cole and Abigail had shifted again. The violence had stripped away another layer of formality, leaving behind a raw awareness of their mutual dependence and the dangerous world they navigated together. Narrator's voice takes on a deeper timbre, hinting at changing landscapes, both external and internal. The rolling prairie began to give way to rugged foothills, the land tilting upwards towards the looming spine of the mountains ahead. The going grew tougher. Grassy slopes turned into rocky inclines, game trails replaced open ground, and the wind carried the colder bite of higher altitudes. Bess, Abigail's packhorse mount, stumbled more often on the uneven terrain, and Abigail found herself using muscles she hadn't known existed just to stay balanced, clinging to the saddle horn on steep descents. Cole seemed even more watchful here, his eyes constantly scanning the tree lines, the rocky outcrops, the draws and canyons that sliced through the landscape. He moved with a predator's quiet alertness, pointing out signs Abigail would have missed. The fresh track of a mountain lion, the disturbed pebbles indicating a recent passage, the distant call of a hawk that might signal more than just a hunting bird. He taught her to read the mountains as he had taught her to read the prairie, his instruction still sparse, practical. See that slide? Loose rock. Stick to the timber. Water down there? See the willows? But check upstream before drinking. Winds coming up from the north. Means weather. Find shelter before sundown. His knowledge was encyclopedic, instinctive. Abigail realized he wasn't just passing through this country. He belonged to it, or perhaps was claimed by it, in a way she was only beginning to grasp. One afternoon, climbing a steep forested ridge, the weather turned abruptly. The sky, clear an hour before, became a bruised, turbulent gray. The north wind howled through the pines, carrying spitting pellets of snow, then hail, then a blinding swirl of white. Winter, it seemed, hadn't fully relinquished its grip on these higher elevations, even in late summer. "Blizzard!" Cole yelled over the wind, pulling his horse alongside hers. "Can't stay exposed! There's an old trapper's lean-to I know, over this ridge, if we can make it." Visibility dropped to near zero. The wind tore at them, snow stinging their faces, ice forming instantly on their clothes. The horses whinnied, panicked, slipping on the suddenly treacherous ground. Cole grabbed Bess's bridle, leading both horses, forcing a path through the blinding storm, shouting encouragement to Abigail, his voice barely audible over the gale. Abigail huddled low, trusting him, her world reduced to the churning white fury and the dark shape of Cole battling ahead. It felt like hours, though it was probably less than one, before Cole finally stopped, pulling the horses into the relative shelter of a dense pine grove beneath an overhanging rock ledge. Tucked back against the rock was a crude, three-sided shelter made of logs and packed earth, barely large enough for two people and their gear, but solid, offering refuge from the wind's main force. "Here!" Cole yelled, already swinging down, pulling Abigail from her horse before her frozen limbs could fail her. He quickly unsaddled the animals, rubbing them down fiercely with saddle blankets, shielding them as best he could within the grove. Then he hustled Abigail inside the lean-to, pushing aside a stiffened hide that served as a door flap. Inside it was dark, cramped, smelling of old smoke, damp earth, and animal musk. But it was out of the wind. Cole fumbled with flint and steel, his fingers stiff with cold, finally coaxing a tiny spark into flame amidst the dry tinder he found in a corner. Slowly, painstakingly, he built a small fire in the crude hearth, its meager light pushing back the gloom, its heat a blessing beyond measure. They huddled close to the flames, shivering uncontrollably at first, then gradually feeling the warmth seep back into their bones. The storm raged outside, a terrifying symphony of wind and ice. Inside the tiny shelter, they were isolated, thrown together in enforced intimacy. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. Abigail risked a glance at Cole. His face, illuminated by the firelight, looked carved from granite, etched with lines of weariness and exposure. Snow crusted his eyebrows and the brim of his hat, which he hadn't removed. "Thank you, Cole," she said softly. Again, he grunted, poking the fire. "Storms happen. Lucky this was here. You seem to know this country well, even its hidden shelters." He shrugged, traveled it some. Running from something? Or towards something? The question slipped out before she could stop it, bolder than she intended. He looked up sharply, his gray eyes narrowed, probing. She expected a deflection, a gruff dismissal. Instead, he stared into the fire for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said finally, his voice low, rough. "Maybe a bit of both." He didn't elaborate, but the admission, however cryptic, felt significant. He was running. Abigail didn't press further. The shared shelter, the shared danger, seemed to demand a respect for boundaries, even as it eroded them. She pulled her blanket tighter, watching the flames dance. To break the silence, she began to speak, hesitantly at first, about her own life. Not about the wedding, the rejection. She wasn't ready to share that wound, but about her quiet upbringing in Redemption Bluff, her father the Reverend, the small-town expectations, the feeling of being trapped even before James Montgomery had changed his mind. She spoke of her love for books, her secret yearning for a wider world she'd only read about, a world beyond sermons and sewing circles. Cole listened, surprisingly attentive, his usual reserve seeming to soften slightly in the close confines of the shelter. He didn't interrupt, just watched the fire, occasionally nodding, his expression thoughtful. When she finally fell silent, embarrassed by her own rambling, he spoke again, his voice quiet. "Sounds like you were living behind fences too, ma'am, just different kinds." Abigail looked at him, surprised by his perception. "Yes," she whispered. "I suppose I was." "Takes courage to climb a fence," Cole observed, looking directly at her now, "especially when you don't know what's on the other side." In his gaze, she saw not just understanding, but a deep, resonant empathy. He knew what it was to leave a defined world behind, to choose the uncertainty of the wild. In that moment, huddled together against the storm, the preacher's daughter and the solitary frontiersman found a common ground deeper than shared hardship. It was the common ground of souls seeking freedom, whatever the cost. The storm blew itself out overnight. They awoke to a world transformed, draped in a thick blanket of pristine snow, sparkling under a brilliant blue sky. The air was biting cold but utterly still. The beauty was breathtaking, but treacherous. Travel would be slow, difficult. Cole efficiently prepared a hot breakfast of flapjacks and bacon, melting snow for coffee. As they ate, Abigail noticed him wince as he moved his left arm. "Cole, you're hurt," she said, concern in her voice. He followed her gaze to his shoulder, where a dark stain was spreading slightly on his buckskin shirt. "Caught a ricochet yesterday, I reckon," he admitted gruffly. "Just a graze." "Let me see," she insisted, putting down her mug. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but then relented, shrugging out of the heavy shirt. The graze wasn't deep, but it was ragged, inflamed, clearly painful. Abigail clicked her tongue. This needs cleaning properly. You men, just ignore things until they fester. She rummaged in her small carpet bag, retrieving her sewing kit, which also contained antiseptic salve and clean cloths she always kept for emergencies. Ignoring Cole's muttered protests about fussing, she gently cleaned the wound with melted snow, applied the salve, and bandaged it firmly with strips torn from a spare petticoat, a practical use for the remnants of her old life. Cole sat stiffly, enduring her ministrations, his usual defenses momentarily lowered by proximity and perhaps surprise at her firm competence. His skin, where exposed, was deeply tanned, crisscrossed with older, faded scars, testament to a hard life, battles fought, dangers survived. Abigail worked quickly, efficiently, trying to ignore the sudden awareness of his bare shoulder, the latent strength in his frame, the unexpected intimacy of the act. When she finished, he pulled his shirt back on, avoiding her eyes. "Obliged, ma'am," he mumbled. "Consider it repayment for the shelter," she replied lightly, trying to ease the sudden tension. They packed up their gear, loaded the horses, and began the slow, arduous task of breaking trail through the deep snow, heading down from the ridge towards the slightly lower elevations where travel might be easier. The going was exhausting. They often had to dismount and lead the horses through deep drifts, plunging thigh-deep into the icy powder. By late afternoon, both they and the animals were nearing their limit. They found another sheltered spot, this time a thick grove of fir trees near a frozen creek, and made camp early. As Cole was tending the horses, Abigail gathered firewood. She ventured slightly further into the trees than usual, searching for dry branches under the snow cover. Rounding a large fir, she stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. Partially hidden beneath a snow-laden bush lay a skeleton, picked clean by scavengers, but unmistakably human, clad in the tattered remnants of buckskin clothing. An old Hawken rifle lay nearby, rusted but intact. Abigail stared, horrified, a cold dread seeping through her. She backed away slowly, then turned and hurried back towards the campsite, her heart pounding. "Cole." He looked up sharply from rubbing down Bess, alerted by the panic in her voice. "What is it?" I found someone," she stammered, pointing back towards the trees. "Bones. A skeleton." Cole's expression tightened. He grabbed his rifle and followed her. He surveyed the grim discovery dispassionately, his eyes missing nothing. He knelt, examining the skull, the scattered bones, the rifle. "Trapper, most likely," he said after a moment. "Caught out in a storm last winter, maybe. Or injured. Starved." He picked up the rifle. "Good gun once." He looked around the immediate area. No sign of foul play. He stood up, his face grim. "We'll give him a decent burial, what we can." It was a somber task. Using the axe and shovel Cole carried, they chipped away at the frozen ground beneath the fir tree, digging a shallow grave. They gathered the bones reverently, wrapped them in a spare blanket, and laid them to rest. Cole said no words, but stood silently for a moment, hat in hand, a gesture of respect for a fellow traveler claimed by the unforgiving wilderness. The incident cast a pall over the evening. Death felt suddenly closer, more tangible. The vast, beautiful landscape held sharp teeth. As they sat by the fire, Abigail shivered despite the warmth. "It makes you think," she said softly, "how quickly life can just end out here." Cole nodded, staring into the flames. "Land doesn't care if you live or die, ma'am. It just is. You respect it. You prepare. You stay watchful. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it ain't." He fell silent again, but Abigail sensed his thoughts were far away, perhaps dwelling on other lonely graves, other dangers faced. The shared experience of burying the unknown trapper created another shift between them. It was a stark reminder of their own mortality, their vulnerability, and their increasing reliance on each other. They were two small figures against a vast, indifferent backdrop, their survival intertwined. As they descended further into the foothills over the next few days, the snow receded, replaced by muddy tracks and swollen streams. The air grew warmer. They began to see signs of other human passage, old campsites, tracks of shod horses, distant smoke from prospectors' camps. Cole grew even more watchful, more reserved. He avoided contact, skirting around areas where others might be present, choosing secluded spots for their nightly camps. Abigail sensed his unease. "Are you expecting trouble, Cole?" she asked one evening. He hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "Let's just say there's folks back east of the mountains I ain't eager to cross trails with." "Who?" He shook his head. "Best you don't know, ma'am. Less you know, safer you are." His evasiveness only fueled her curiosity and a growing sense of worry. What kind of trouble was he in? Was she now implicated just by association? Was this rebel cowboy not just independent, but genuinely dangerous or endangered? The question hung unspoken between them. Then, one afternoon, as they rode through a narrow canyon, the decision was taken out of their hands. Rounding a sharp bend, they came face to face with 3 riders blocking the trail. Abigail's heart leaped into her throat. These weren't opportunistic bandits like the last group. These men looked different, harder, colder, wearing range clothes but carrying themselves with an almost military precision. They didn't draw their weapons immediately, just sat their horses, their eyes fixed on Cole Tanner. Cole reined in sharply, his body instantly tensing, his hand hovering near the butt of his peacemaker. His face, usually guarded, was now rigid, his gray eyes narrowed to slits. "Well, Tanner," the lead rider said, his voice flat, cold. He was older than the others, with a deeply lined face and eyes that held no warmth. "Been a long time. Heard you were drifting out this way." Cole didn't answer, just watched them, his gaze flicking between the 3 men, assessing the threat. Who are they, Cole?" Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. Cole spoke without looking at her, his voice low and tight. "Bounty men, sent by a man named Riker." "Riker?" The name meant nothing to Abigail. "He reckons I owe him something," Cole said grimly. "Something I ain't gonna pay." "Riker wants you back, Tanner," the lead bounty hunter continued, ignoring Abigail. "Alive, preferably, but he ain't particular. Don't make this difficult." He subtly shifted his hand towards his own gun belt. Here it was. The twist. Cole wasn't just a loner running towards freedom. He was running from a specific, dangerous past. A man named Riker wanted him, badly enough to send hired guns across the territories. And Abigail was caught right in the middle of it. The canyon walls seemed to close in, the air thick with menace. Cole had a choice to make. Fight, surrender, run. And whatever he chose, Abigail knew her fate was now inextricably tied to his. The freedom of the prairie suddenly felt like a closing trap. "All right, partner. The trap is sprung. Bounty hunters on the trail, Cole's past rearing its ugly head, and Abigail caught square in the crossfire. Freedom's looking mighty dangerous now. Let's see how they navigate this canyon, literal and figurative." Cole Tanner didn't hesitate. Fighting 3 armed men in a narrow canyon was suicide. Surrendering meant returning to whatever hell Riker had planned for him. And running wasn't his style, not when Abigail was beside him. His mind worked with lightning speed, calculating odds, searching for an edge. He saw it, a narrow game trail leading steeply up the canyon wall just behind them, partially obscured by brush. It was their only chance, however slim. "When I move, ride," Cole hissed to Abigail under his breath. "Up that trail behind us. Don't stop." Before the bounty hunters could react to his sudden shift in focus, Cole spurred his horse violently, not forward, but sideways, crashing directly into the lead bounty hunter's mount. The collision sent both horses stumbling, the bounty hunter cursing as he fought for control. In that instant of chaos, Cole yelled, "Now, Abigail, ride!" Abigail reacted purely on instinct, spurred by the terror and adrenaline flooding her system. She yanked Bess's reins, kicking the sturdy packhorse hard, forcing her towards the steep hidden trail Cole had indicated. Bess scrambled, finding purchase on the rocky path, driven by fear. Cole, meanwhile, drew his peacemaker, firing not to kill but to distract, sending shots kicking up dust near the remaining two bounty hunters' horses, forcing them to rear and adding to the confusion. He didn't wait to see the effect. He wheeled his own horse, digging in his heels, and charged after Abigail up the narrow, treacherous path, bullets whining past him as the bounty hunters recovered and opened fire. The trail was barely wide enough for a single horse, steep and littered with loose rock. Bess slipped, scrambled, Abigail clinging desperately to the saddle horn, her heart pounding against her ribs. Cole pushed his own horse relentlessly behind her, urging her on, glancing back occasionally to see if they were being pursued up the track. For now, the bounty hunters seemed hesitant, perhaps unwilling to follow onto such unfavorable ground immediately, choosing instead to fire futile shots from below. They reached a small ledge, partially screened by stunted pines, and paused, horses heaving, sides slick with sweat. Below, the bounty hunters regrouped, staring up at the trail, clearly debating their next move. "They won't come up this way," Cole said, his voice tight, breathing hard. "Too easy to pick 'em off. They'll circle round, try to cut us off higher up, or wait us out." He scanned the terrain above them. "We gotta keep moving, get higher, find better cover before they block the passes." There was no time for recriminations, no time for explanations. Survival was the only imperative. Cole took the lead again, pushing onward and upward, navigating the maze of game trails and rocky slopes with an urgency that spoke of intimate familiarity with being hunted. Abigail followed blindly, her earlier exhaustion replaced by a grim determination fueled by fear. She stole glances at Cole's face. It was set, hard, his gray eyes constantly moving, assessing. The easy camaraderie of the past few days felt like a distant memory, replaced by the stark reality of his dangerous life. Who was this man Riker? What had Cole done? The questions burned, but she knew this wasn't the time to ask. They climbed for hours, the terrain growing wilder, more rugged. Cole pushed them hard, stopping only for brief rests to water the horses at hidden seeps. He seemed to know these mountains like the back of his hand, choosing paths that offered concealment, avoiding open ridges. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows across the peaks, he finally led them into a small, hidden basin, almost completely encircled by high rock walls, accessible only by a narrow, easily defensible cleft. A trickle of water ran down one wall, pooling among ferns and moss. "We'll make camp here tonight," Cole announced, swinging down stiffly. "They won't find us easy in the dark. We rest, move out before dawn." While Abigail tended the horses, Cole scouted the entrance to the basin, piling rocks to create a low barricade, checking sight lines. He moved with the grim efficiency of a soldier preparing for a siege. Later, huddled by a tiny, smokeless fire built deep within the rock cleft, the tension between them was palpable. Abigail finally broke the silence. "Cole," she said softly. "Who is Riker? Why does he want you?" Cole stared into the meager flames, his face haggard in the flickering light. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Riker, Harrison Riker, used to be my partner," he said, his voice low, rough with reluctance. "Years ago, we were acquisition specialists." Abigail frowned. "Acquisition specialists?" "Finding things people had lost," Cole clarified grimly. "Or things they didn't know they possessed. Sometimes, things they didn't want found. Land claims, hidden gold seams, lost family fortunes. Riker had the contacts, the information. I had the skills, tracking, finding, persuading if need be." He paused, the silence heavy with unspoken violence. "We did well. Too well. Riker got greedy. Wanted more than his share on a big find down in the Sangre de Cristos, a dispute over mining rights, gold hidden by an old Spanish family. We argued. It got ugly." He touched a faded scar near his temple. "He tried to kill me, leave me for dead, take it all. I fought back. Someone ended up dead, one of Riker's hired guns. Not by my hand directly, but in the fight. I took my share, the part I could prove was mine, and lit out. Been looking over my shoulder ever since." He finally looked at Abigail, his gray eyes filled with a bleak honesty. Riker's powerful. Got money, connections. He put a price on my head. Not just for the share I took, but for defiance, for surviving. He wants me back, wants to make an example. Abigail absorbed his story, the pieces clicking into place. His solitary life, his watchfulness, his lethal skill with a gun, his reluctance to get close to settlements or people. He wasn't just a rebel, he was a fugitive. So the bounty hunters, been dodging him for years, Cole confirmed tiredly. Usually work alone or in pairs. Never seen a crew this organized this far north. Riker must be getting impatient. Or maybe... He hesitated. Maybe someone told him where I might be. Abigail felt a chill despite the fire. Had their encounter at the wrecked stagecoach somehow filtered back? Or was it just bad luck? "I'm sorry, Cole," she whispered. "Sorry you're mixed up in this, ma'am," he said gruffly. "Wasn't my intention to drag you into my trouble." "You didn't drag me," Abigail corrected him quietly. "I chose to follow. I just didn't know the full danger." She looked at him, seeing not just the capable frontiersman, but a man haunted by his past, fighting a lonely battle. Her fear was still present, but it was now overlaid with a fierce, protective loyalty. "What do we do now?" Cole rubbed his temples, the lines of exhaustion deep around his eyes. "We keep moving. Try to lose him in the high country. There's passes further west, rougher trails. Maybe shake him there. If not..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Abigail understood. If not, they would have to make a stand. The next few days were a tense game of cat and mouse. Cole led them through bewildering, trackless wilderness, doubling back, using streams to hide their passage, pushing the horses and themselves to the limit. Abigail marveled at his endurance, his woodsman's craft. She did her part, riding without complaint, tending the camp, watching his back while he rested. The shared danger, the forced reliance on each other, forged their bond tighter, deeper. The silences were still there, but now they felt less like distance and more like shared understanding. One evening, exhausted, Abigail stumbled near the campfire and Cole caught her, his arms strong around her waist, preventing a fall. This time, he didn't pull away immediately. Their eyes met, held. The air crackled with unspoken emotion, fear, exhaustion, gratitude, and something else. Something warmer, more potent, blooming unexpectedly in the midst of danger. Cole released her slowly, his expression unreadable. But Abigail saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes before the usual mask snapped back into place. They never spoke of the moment, but it lingered between them. They spotted the bounty hunters twice more, distant figures on a high ridge, briefly glimpsed across a valley. Cole managed to evade them both times, but it was clear the pursuit was relentless. They were being herded, pushed further west, deeper into the mountains, towards a place Cole seemed increasingly reluctant to go. "There's a place," he said one night, staring at the crude map he'd sketched in the dirt. "Called Devil's Notch, narrow pass, only way through these peaks for 50 miles south. If they block that, we're trapped." "Can we beat them there? Beat them?" Abigail asked anxiously. Cole shook his head. "Doubtful. They know this country too, the lead man, Quint, does. They'll expect us to head for the notch. They'll likely be waiting." "So what do we do?" Cole traced a line on his map, away from the notch, towards a forbidding cluster of peaks marked with a skull and crossbones on older survey maps. "There's another way," he said slowly. "An old Ute trail. Bad medicine, folks say. Goes through rough country, haunted grounds, according to legend. Most riders avoid it, even bounty men." He looked at Abigail. "It's dangerous, maybe more dangerous than Quint. But it might be our only chance to lose them for good." Abigail met his gaze, her heart pounding. Haunted grounds? Bad medicine? It sounded terrifying. But the alternative facing Quint and his men at Devil's Notch seemed like certain death or capture. "I trust you, Cole," she said simply. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded grimly. "All right then. Tomorrow, we leave the known trails behind." The journey into the haunted grounds lived up to its reputation. The trail was faint, treacherous, winding through shadowy canyons and across windswept, desolate plateaus where strange rock formations stood like ancient sentinels. The air felt heavy, watchful. An eerie silence pressed in on them, unnerving after the familiar sounds of the lower slopes. The horses became skittish, rolling their eyes, starting at shadows. Even Cole seemed more tense, his hand rarely straying far from his gun. They saw no game, heard few birds. It felt like a land holding its breath. Abigail, despite her fear, felt a strange sense of awe. The landscape was stark, brutal, yet possessed a wild, desolate beauty, unlike anything she had ever seen. It felt ancient, untouched, indifferent to human concerns. One night, camped in a narrow defile beneath looming cliffs, Abigail awoke abruptly. The fire had died down, the moon hidden behind clouds. She heard a sound, a low, guttural chanting, seeming to echo off the canyon walls, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic beat of a drum. Her blood ran cold. "Cole?" she whispered urgently. He was already awake, sitting up, rifle in hand, listening intently. The chanting continued for several minutes, eerie, unsettling, then faded away as mysteriously as it had begun. "What was that?" Abigail breathed, her voice trembling. Cole shook his head, his expression grim. "Don't know. Ute ghosts, maybe." He didn't sound entirely convinced it was supernatural. Could just be echoes playing tricks. Or maybe someone else uses these trails. They kept a nervous watch until dawn, but the sounds didn't return. The incident, however, left them both deeply unsettled. Were they truly alone? Or had they traded one pursuer for another, perhaps more dangerous one? They pushed on, eager to leave the eerie canyons behind. Finally, after 2 nerve-wracking days, the trail began to descend, the landscape softening, trees reappearing, the air losing its oppressive weight. They emerged into a wide, sunlit valley, greener and more welcoming than the country they had left behind. Cole reined in, surveying the valley floor, a look of profound relief on his face. "We made it through," he said, his voice holding a note of wonder. "We lost him." Abigail felt tears of sheer relief sting her eyes. They had faced down bounty hunters, blizzards, treacherous trails, and unsettling mysteries, and they had survived, together. As they rode down into the valley side by side, a fragile sense of peace settled over Abigail for the first time since leaving Redemption Bluff. They found a clear stream, made camp in a sheltered aspen grove. That night, the mood was different. The immediate threat had passed. The tension eased, replaced by a quiet intimacy born of shared ordeal and survival. Sitting by the fire, Cole finally began to speak more freely of his past, not just the conflict with Riker, but his solitary years, the hardships, the moments of unexpected beauty, the reasons he kept running. Abigail, in turn, found herself telling him about James Montgomery, the planned wedding, the public humiliation, the impulsive flight that had led her to the wrecked stagecoach. Sharing their vulnerabilities, their past wounds, felt like the final lock clicking open between them. Later, as the fire died down, Cole looked at her, his gray eyes dark with emotion in the faint light. "Abigail," he began, his voice husky. He reached out, his rough hand gently cupping her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her breath catching. The distance between them vanished. He lowered his head, his lips meeting hers tentatively at first, then with a growing hunger born of long denial, shared danger, and unexpected tenderness. Abigail responded with equal fervor, years of repressed longing and the raw emotions of the past weeks surging through her. It wasn't the chaste, expected kiss of her former life. It was elemental, desperate, a claiming and a surrender all at once under the vast, indifferent stars of the western sky. In the days that followed, camped in the peaceful valley, their relationship shifted irrevocably. The barriers were down. They were no longer just rescuer and rescued, guide and follower. They were man and woman, drawn together by forces neither fully understood, but both were unwilling to deny. They explored the valley, fished in the stream, talked for hours, planned cautiously for the future. Cole spoke of finding land further west, maybe Oregon Territory, somewhere Riker's reach wouldn't extend, somewhere they could build a life truly free. Abigail, who had fled her old life with no plan, now saw a future taking shape, a future with this quiet, capable, haunted man who had shown her both the harshness and the beauty of the world, and the strength within herself. But the prairie rarely allows for easy peace. Their idyllic interlude was shattered one morning by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Not Quint and his bounty hunters, but a lone Ute warrior, appearing silently at the edge of their camp, his face stern, impassive. Cole immediately stood, respectfully but warily, hand away from his gun. The warrior spoke, his voice guttural, using a mixture of Ute and broken Spanish, pointing back towards the haunted grounds. Cole listened intently, his expression growing serious. After a tense exchange, the Ute warrior nodded curtly and melted back into the trees as silently as he had appeared. "What is it, Cole?" Abigail asked anxiously. Cole turned to her, his face grim. "Remember those sounds we heard? The chanting?" Abigail nodded. "It wasn't ghosts, it was them. A small band of UTEs who use those canyons for sacred ceremonies. Their shamans saw us pass through. They consider those grounds forbidden to outsiders." "Are they angry?" "He says, we disturbed the spirits," Cole translated slowly. "He says the spirits demand a price for our trespass. Or maybe," Cole added, his eyes narrowing, "maybe they demand a price." "What kind of price?" Cole looked troubled. "He wasn't specific. Said we would know soon. Said the mountains watch." A cold dread returned, chilling their newfound peace. Had they escaped Riker only to fall foul of offended spirits or opportunistic warriors? The Ute's warning hung over them, a new, unseen threat. They broke camp immediately, Cole's urgency renewed, pushing west again, out of the valley, towards the distant promise of safer territory. But now they watched the trees, the rocks, the sky, not just for bounty hunters, but for other, more ancient dangers. The final climax of their journey, it seemed, was yet to come. It wouldn't be just about escaping Riker or defying society. It would be about finding peace in a land that guarded its secrets jealously, a land that demanded respect, resilience, and perhaps a sacrifice before it truly offered freedom.